My entire career, I was trained to read a room before anyone in it knew they were being read. 34 years on the bench of the Northern District of Illinois taught me that the truth rarely arrives in a confession. It arrives in the way a man's thumb twitches when he lies. It arrives in the half-second pause before a woman agrees with something she doesn't believe. I spent my life listening for those silences, the ones that scream louder than any testimony. I never imagined I would one day have to use every instinct I ever sharpened to save my own daughter from a man I had personally walked her down the aisle to meet. My name is Evelyn. I'm 67 years old. I live in a quiet brick colonial on the north shore of Lake Michigan, in a town where the neighbors wave and the autumn leaves settle on the sidewalks like they're paid to look picturesque. I retired from the federal bench 4 years ago, traded my robe for a rose garden, and told myself that the hardest decisions of my life were behind me. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things, and the thing that humbles you most when you've spent your whole life being right is discovering the one blind spot you didn't know you had. Her name is Claire, my only daughter. 31 years old when this story begins. She's a pediatric oncology researcher at Northwestern, the kind of woman who gives presentations at international conferences and still calls her mother every Sunday night at 7 sharp. She has her father's steady hands and my stubborn chin, and when she was a little girl, she used to stand on the bathroom counter and practice her arguments in the mirror. "Mommy, I object," she'd say, because she'd heard me use the phrase. She was going to be someone before she even knew what someone meant. She met him at a charity gala in the spring of the year before all this began. His name was Brandon Halloway. He was 34, a managing partner at a private equity firm downtown, with the kind of jawline that looks designed by committee and a smile he wore the way other men wear cologne. When Claire first brought him to our house for dinner, he stood in our foyer with a bouquet of white peonies and told me he had read 2 of my published opinions. He quoted me back to myself. He complimented the hopper print in the hallway and asked my husband, Gerald, about his golf handicap. He was flawless. That was the first thing I should have noticed. Flawless men make me nervous. I've seen too many of them on the defense side of my courtroom. But Claire was radiant. She laughed more that night than I'd heard her laugh in a year. She touched his wrist when she spoke to him, and he looked at her the way men in paintings look at saints. Gerald squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that our girl had finally found a good one. I smiled back. I drank my wine. I pushed the small, cold feeling in my chest into the same drawer where I kept my old gavel, and I locked it. They were engaged 6 months later. Married 8 months after that, in a ceremony at the Drake Hotel that cost more than my first house. His mother, Victoria, flew in from Palm Beach in a cream-colored suit that probably had its own insurance policy. She air-kissed me on both cheeks and told me, in a voice like chilled champagne, that Claire was so lucky to be joining their family. I remember watching her watch my daughter across the ballroom during the first dance. She wasn't smiling. She was evaluating. The way a jeweler evaluates a stone she's already decided to recut. I should have said something then. I didn't. The changes began so softly I mistook them for maturity. Claire stopped wearing the red lipstick she'd worn since she was 19. She said Brandon thought it was too loud for her face. She cut her hair, the long dark waves she'd inherited from my mother, into a chin-length bob because Brandon said long hair on women over 30 looked desperate. She started declining dinners at our house, and when she did come, she watched the door as if she were waiting for a bill collector. She laughed less. She laughed quieter. She laughed only when someone else laughed first. I told myself she was adjusting. I told myself every marriage had its first-year growing pains. I told myself that a mother who clings too tight is a mother who loses her daughter twice, so I gave her space. I sent her articles about the Cubs. I baked her favorite lemon bars and mailed them in tins. I waited. And while I waited, he was carving her down to a size that fit inside his pocket. The first warning sign I couldn't ignore came in October, about 14 months into the marriage. Claire came to the house for my birthday lunch. She wore a gray cashmere turtleneck on a day that was 68 degrees. She sat at my kitchen table and ate 3 bites of salad and told me she wasn't very hungry. When I hugged her goodbye at the door, she flinched. Not from me, from my hand when it brushed her upper arm. A small, involuntary flinch. The kind of flinch a body learns before the mind is willing to admit what it's learning. I stood on my porch after she drove away, and I watched her taillights disappear down the street, and I felt something old wake up inside me. Something I hadn't used in 4 years. The part of me that used to read a defendant's face across a courtroom and know, with absolute certainty, whether he had done what the prosecutor said he had done. That night, I called an old friend. His name is Raymond. He was an assistant U.S. attorney under me for a decade, and he runs his own firm now, specializing in family law and domestic violence litigation. I told him what I had seen. I told him what I suspected. And then I told him something I had never said out loud to anyone, not even to Gerald. I told him I needed him to start building a file. Raymond didn't ask me why. He knew me well enough. He just said, "I'll make some calls. Send me every detail you can remember. Dates, places, quotes, whatever you've got. Don't tell Claire. Don't tell Gerald. Not yet." I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Outside, the maples were shedding their leaves. I wrote down every word Brandon had ever said to my daughter in my presence. I wrote down every time I had watched her face change when she got a text. I wrote down the flinch. I wrote down the turtleneck. I wrote down the way Victoria had looked at her across the ballroom like a woman appraising livestock. Then I put on my coat and drove to the hardware store and bought a small, discreet audio recorder, the kind I used to use in chambers for note-taking. I put it in my purse. I kept my purse with me every time I saw my daughter. Over the next 4 months, I watched, I listened, I collected. I watched Brandon interrupt her mid-sentence at Thanksgiving dinner and say, "Sweetheart, you're rambling again," in that soft, paternal tone that makes strangers think a man is patient. I watched him order for her at restaurants without asking what she wanted. I watched him squeeze her wrist under the table at Christmas when she laughed too loudly at one of Gerald's jokes, a squeeze so quick I would have missed it if I hadn't been looking. I watched her rub that wrist later in the hallway when she thought no one could see. I watched Victoria, too. Victoria, who called my daughter dear, the way a vet calls a stray. Victoria, who suggested at every family gathering that Claire might consider leaving her research position because demanding careers put such stress on a young marriage. Victoria, who pulled me aside at a Halloway family brunch in January and told me, in the kindest voice imaginable, that I needed to stop coddling Claire because Brandon is trying to make a woman out of her and you keep making her a child again. I smiled at Victoria. I thanked her for her concern. I sipped my mimosa, and in my purse, the recorder turned her voice into a permanent piece of evidence. Raymond and I met every other Tuesday at a coffee shop in Evanston, where nobody knew either of us. I brought him my notes and my recordings. He brought me updates. He had quietly retained a private investigator, a woman named Denise, who specialized in documenting domestic abuse cases for prosecution. Denise had photographed Brandon's car parked outside the apartment of a woman who was not my daughter on 3 separate Thursday evenings. She had obtained, through entirely legal channels, records showing that Brandon had transferred $47,000 from a joint account into a personal account that Claire didn't know existed. Raymond had drafted a custody contingency, though Claire had no children yet, because he wanted us prepared if she became pregnant. He had identified a safe short-term residence, a guest house owned by a retired judge I'd served with, completely off any public record. He had a restraining order drafted, waiting for signature. He had 2 former federal prosecutors on standby to file criminal assault charges the moment we had admissible evidence of physical violence. We were building a fortress around my daughter while she was still inside the tower, and she didn't know. I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Women in her situation, I knew from 100 cases on my docket, don't leave when you hand them the key. They leave when they are ready, and they are ready when the illusion breaks. My job wasn't to break the illusion. My job was to make sure that when it broke, there was a ladder waiting. The illusion broke on the evening of April 12th. It was Gerald's 70th birthday. I had reserved a private room at an Italian restaurant in the Gold Coast, a place Gerald had loved since we were first married. 12 people were invited. Claire and Brandon. Victoria, who had flown up from Florida specifically, she said, to honor dear Gerald. My sister and her husband, two of Gerald's closest friends from the firm where he'd practiced environmental law. A handful of neighbors. The private room had wood-paneled walls and a long table laid with white linens and votive candles. And when Claire walked in wearing a sleeveless navy dress, my heart stopped for a full second before it started again. There was a bruise on her upper arm. Yellow-purple, the shape of a thumb and 4 fingers, fresh enough to still be swollen at the edges, old enough that she had thought, tonight of all nights, she could cover it with makeup. She hadn't covered it well enough. I saw it the moment she took off her wrap. I didn't say a word. I hugged her. I kissed her cheek. I told her she looked beautiful. And as I held her, I pressed the small button on the recorder in my purse, and I prayed that God would forgive me for what I was about to let happen in front of 12 witnesses and 1 security camera mounted above the door. Dinner was served. Gerald made a toast. Brandon stood and delivered a charming, seamless tribute to his father-in-law that made half the table reach for their napkins. Victoria beamed at her son like he was a trophy she'd polished herself. Claire smiled, the smile I had watched her learn over the past 2 years, the small, closed smile that never reached her eyes. And then came the moment. Claire, in an effort to contribute to the conversation, in an effort to be a full person at her own father's birthday dinner, began to share a story about a breakthrough her research team had made the week before. It was a real breakthrough, a genuine one, a promising new protocol for pediatric leukemia patients. She spoke with the old animation in her voice, the Claire I remembered, the Claire who had stood on bathroom counters and objected. Gerald was leaning forward. My sister was asking questions. The table was hers. Brandon interrupted her, gently at first. Honey, let's not bore everyone with the lab stuff. Claire flushed and kept going. Brandon interrupted her again, louder. Claire, sweetheart, nobody wants a lecture tonight. Claire stopped, mid-sentence, and she tried to laugh, and the laugh came out wrong, and she reached for her water glass, and her hand was shaking, and she knocked the glass over. Water spread across the white linen tablecloth. Not much, just a small, dark stain the size of a grapefruit. Brandon's face changed. I have seen that exact expression on maybe 400 defendants in my career. It is the face a certain kind of man makes when a mask slips and he doesn't care in that instant whether anyone sees the face underneath. He turned to my daughter, and in front of my husband, in front of my sister, in front of his own mother, in front of me, he raised his right hand and he struck her across the face. The sound was small, smaller than you would think. Flesh on flesh, a dry pop. Claire's head snapped to the side. A red bloom the shape of his palm rose on her cheek. The table went completely silent, and then Victoria began to clap. Slow, deliberate claps. 3 of them. And she said in a voice designed to carry, "That's how a real woman learns. My mother taught me the same way. I want you to understand something. In 34 years on the bench, I have heard men confess to murder. I have heard women describe what was done to them by people who promised to love them. I have heard 1,000 forms of human cruelty dressed up in 1,000 different outfits. But in that moment, at that table, with my daughter's cheek glowing red and my son-in-law's hand still raised and his mother applauding like she was at the opera, I felt a cold I had never felt before, a cold so complete it wasn't even anger. It was clarity. I did not scream, I did not weep, I did not reach for my daughter, though every cell in my body wanted to. I stood up from the table. I picked up my purse. I walked out of the private room into the hallway by the coat check. I took my phone out of my bag, and I made one call. The call was to Raymond. I said 6 words. It happened. Tonight. I'm ready. He said 4 words back. Go time. Stay calm. I hung up and I walked back into the private room where the silence had continued and nobody had moved, because shock takes time to thaw. And I went to my daughter and I knelt beside her chair and I took her hand and I said, quietly, but loud enough for the whole table to hear, Claire, honey, you are leaving with me tonight. You are not going home with him. Your things are already packed and waiting at my house. I have an attorney on his way here right now, and by morning you will have a restraining order, a safe place to stay that is not our home, and the beginning of a criminal case against the man who just hit you. I have been preparing this for 9 months. I should have told you sooner. I'm telling you now. You don't have to do anything except stand up and walk out with your mother. Claire stared at me. Tears were running down her face, and her hand was shaking in mine, and she opened her mouth and no sound came out. Brandon stood up. His chair scraped hard against the floor. He said, Evelyn, you are so far out of line right now. I looked at him. I looked at him the way I used to look at men in my courtroom when I was about to hand down a sentence they hadn't prepared for. I said, Mr. Halloway, there is a security camera above the door of this room. There is a recording device in my purse which has been active for the last 40 minutes. There are 11 sober adults at this table, any of whom can be subpoenaed. There is a file in my attorney's office that contains photographs of your car outside another woman's apartment building on the evenings of November 3rd, November 17th, and December 1st. There is documentation of $47,000 you moved out of a joint account without my daughter's knowledge. There is a criminal complaint being drafted as we speak. My advice to you, and I am giving it to you as a courtesy I assure you I do not owe you, is to sit down, finish your drink, and say nothing else until you have an attorney of your own. The color drained out of his face in stages. First his forehead, then his cheeks, last his mouth. Victoria stood up. She put her napkin on the table with theatrical care. She said, Evelyn, you are humiliating this family in a public restaurant. I turned to her, and I want you to know that this is the moment I had been waiting for. Not with pleasure, but with the patience of a woman who has been sitting on the evidence of a crime for a very long time. I said, Victoria, I have a recording of you from the Halloway family brunch in January, telling me that your son is trying to make a woman out of my daughter. I have a recording of you, 38 seconds ago, applauding your son for striking his wife and saying your own mother taught you. The same way, that recording will be entered into evidence at your son's assault trial as a demonstration of a pattern of ratified domestic violence within your family, which, under Illinois law, is a factor a judge may consider when determining the severity of sentencing. I don't know if you'll be charged with anything yourself. That's not my call to make. It will be the state's attorney's. But I do know that by this time next week, your name is going to be on a pleading in a courthouse where I sat for 3 decades. And not a single judge in that building is going to be unaware of who you are or what you did at this dinner. Victoria sat down, slowly, like a woman whose knees had stopped working. Gerald stood up. My quiet, gentle Gerald. He went around the table and put his hands on our daughter's shoulders, and he said, Baby girl, let's go home. Claire stood up. She was still crying. She didn't look at Brandon. She didn't look at Victoria. She looked at me, and I saw, for the first time in 2 years, my daughter's eyes fully open. She picked up her wrap. She took my hand, and we walked out. Raymond was waiting in the lobby of the restaurant when we came down the stairs. He had a paralegal with him and a folder 6 inches thick. A police officer was standing near the host stand. The restaurant manager had been quietly briefed on the phone, a phone call Raymond had made from his car on the drive over, because Raymond is the kind of lawyer who thinks of everything. Brandon Halloway was served with a protective order before he finished paying the bill. He was arrested 3 days later on a charge of misdemeanor battery, which was upgraded to a felony after the investigation into his finances uncovered evidence of wire fraud that had nothing to do with my daughter and everything to do with how his firm moved money. Victoria Halloway retained an expensive Chicago attorney and flew home to Palm Beach. She did not face criminal charges. She did face a civil suit for intentional infliction of emotional distress, which settled out of court for a sum that will, I suspect, put a noticeable dent in her next cream-colored suit budget. The divorce took 9 months. Claire got the condo. The savings she didn't know had been drained and then recovered, and a restraining order that will be in effect for another 4 years. Brandon pled down to a suspended sentence and a year of court-mandated counseling for domestic violence offenders. He will never work in financial services in the state of Illinois again. His license was pulled 6 weeks after the arrest. Claire moved back into our guest room for a while. She slept 14 hours a night for the first week. She cried in my kitchen while I made her grilled cheese sandwiches the way I did when she was 7. She started therapy with a specialist Raymond recommended. She went back to the lab. She cut her hair again, all the way down this time. A close crop that made her look like a woman who had decided, finally, what her own face was for. She runs in the mornings now. I can hear her feet on the sidewalk from my bedroom window before the sun is up. The sound of it is the sound of my child coming back to herself. I want to say something to the woman listening to this, and I know she's listening because she always is. I know you are washing dishes or folding laundry or driving home from a job you hate, and you have the volume turned low because he might come into the room and ask what you're listening to. I know you have a bruise somewhere he picked because it wouldn't show. I know you laughed this week at a joke that wasn't funny because it was safer than not laughing. I know you have told yourself you are overreacting, that it isn't that bad, that every marriage has hard seasons, that your mother had it worse and she survived. Your mother should not have had to survive it. Neither should you. You don't need a federal judge for a mother. You don't need a file and a private investigator and a restraining order drafted 9 months in advance. You need one phone number, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 800-799-7233. You can call from a parking lot, from a bathroom, from the break room at work. They will not tell you what to do. They will ask you what you need. That is a different kind of conversation than the one you have been having with yourself, and it is the conversation that begins the way out. I failed my daughter for 14 months. I want to be honest about that. I was too careful. I was too worried about overstepping, about being a smothering mother, about respecting her marriage. I waited too long to trust what my eyes were telling me. The bruise on her arm that October was not the first bruise. It was only the first one I was willing to see. That is a thing I will carry for the rest of my life. But I want to tell you the other half of the truth, too. The half that matters more. Because if you are watching this, you might be the mother. You might be the sister. You might be the best friend who has been watching her shrink for 2 years and telling yourself it isn't your place. I am here to tell you that it is your place. Start the file, write down the dates, save the texts, call a lawyer, and ask what your options look like if she ever asks for help. Build the ladder before the tower falls, because when the tower falls, and it will fall, she is going to need somewhere to land. And she is going to need someone who believed her before she said a word. I'm Evelyn. I'm 67 years old. I spent my life on the bench, and I thought my most important work was over. It turns out the most important judgment I ever rendered was the one I delivered in a private dining room on the evening of April 12th, standing over a plate of cold veal Milanese, with my daughter's tears on my hands and a recording device quietly turning in my purse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I had prepared. That's the lesson, if there is one. Love without preparation is a wish. Love with preparation is a rescue. If you are watching this, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Tell me the name of the woman in your life you've been worried about. Or don't. Just hold her name in your mouth for a second and promise her something quietly. I'll be reading every comment. I read all of them. And if this story reached you tonight, If it put its hand on your shoulder the way I wish someone had put a hand on mine 14 months earlier, then share it with one woman you love. Just one. That's all I'm asking. You are not alone. You were never alone. You were never alone. And the call you are afraid to make is the call that ends the silence. Make it tonight.